Hi. What do you see? Who am I? Do you see a woman? Or do you see a black person? And if you do see a black woman, what does that mean to you? Racism exists in every level of society, from individuals to the highest social structures. I challenge you to become anti-racist. Yes, you. How will you do this? By watching me, you will be able to recognize the different categories of racism and racial discrimination, understand the historical impact and ongoing legacy of racism in Canada and white privilege, identify racial discrimination and harassment in different spheres of society, and conceive the consequences of racism. Pretty heavy stuff, but there's a good ending for you. After you learn all this, you get to apply your knowledge. I'll show you what to do against racism, the benefits of living in a society without racism, and how to commit to being anti-racist. Come, let's begin. Number 1, what is race? The concept of race is often linked to a person's physical characteristics such as skin color, nose shape, eye shape, hair texture, and others. However, race does not exist. You heard that right? Race does not exist. Many scientists have shown that classification by race has no legitimate biological basis. There is only the human race. You see, we're really all one. Why is race still talked about? We talk about race because people attribute traits and characteristics to people based on how they perceive them because of the color of their skin. Giving meaning to biological characteristics to identify people is to assign them to a general category of people or groups. This is called the process of racialization. Number 2, racialization. Racialization is the process of the social construction of race that allows for the domination of one group over another, whereby societies view races as different and unequal socially, economically, and politically. The process of racialization is therefore intended to differentiate, inferiorize, and exclude those who are considered non-white. It should be noted that the process of racialization usually excludes white people, at least in Canada. Whites are considered the norm, the reference, the universal representation of all humanity, while non-whites are perceived as different, exceptions, particularities. Number 3, racism. What is racism? Racism is defined as a form of prejudice that includes implicit or explicit beliefs, false assumptions, and ideologies of superiority towards one racial group over another. Racism can be explicit or implicit, meaning that it can be manifested either directly or indirectly. Examples of explicit racism are racist comments, threats of physical violence, and actual violence against a racialized person. And racist cyberbullying through information technology and social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and racist websites. Implicit racism are racial microaggressions. They are brief, verbal, or nonverbal behavioral and environmental everyday indignities that may appear trivial, intentional, or unintentional, which communicate racially hostile, derogatory, or negative insults and remarks to the target person or group. Although these racist behaviors are subtle in nature, they are just as painful for the person experiencing them, especially as it is difficult to prove them. Have you heard any of these statements? I get them all the time. Where are you from? I'm not racist because I have black friends. Everyone can succeed if they work hard. By the way, in case you're wondering, I'm from Halifax. Number 4, individual or interpersonal racism. Interpersonal racism occurs when our racist beliefs, assumptions, and behaviors, whether implicit or explicit, are embedded in interpersonal interactions. Examples of interpersonal racism include threats and harassment, social exclusion, stigmatization, and unfair treatment. One of the most common examples of interpersonal racism is the fact that some white students exclude Black students from their work groups, either because they do not want to work with them because of their skin color or because they think they are less intelligent. Another very common example of interpersonal racism is that of white parents implicitly or explicitly refusing to allow their children to go out with Black youth. Number 5. Institutional racism. Institutional racism takes place within institutions including schools, governments, and religious institutes. It is policies and practices which claim that all races are treated equally and see equal outcomes, while racialized people are consistently oppressed and disadvantaged by these policies and practices. Number 6, systemic or structural racism. Structural or systemic racism involves racial bias across institutions, including public and private policies, institutional practices, and cultural representations, among others. It reinforces the unequal treatment of racial groups by systematically privileging the majority racial group and presenting disadvantages for minority racial groups. For example, in Canada, despite efforts for change, the school curriculum is still designed for white middle-class students. This is evident in history classes, for example, which explore Canadian history from a white perspective and fail to give a voice to racial minority groups who also have a place in history, including Indigenous people. You know what I'm talking about. Number 7, internalized racism. Internalized racism is generally defined as the acceptance and integration of negative beliefs, prejudices, and stereotypes about one's own abilities and values by individuals of a racial group into a dominant racial group. Internalized racism occurs when people who are victims of racism themselves adopt beliefs and behaviors which support the racism they experience. An example is thinking, hey, maybe I am not good enough. It is a major consequence of living in a racist society and experiencing racism. As a result of listening to racist comments, ideas, and thoughts, and having racist experiences, some racialized people end up adhering to the racist views of the dominant group. For example, a manager or team leader who is a member of racialized communities refuses to give rewarding tasks to another racialized person because they have internalized several social prejudices about racialized communities. Number 8, racial profiling. Racial profiling occurs when an authoritarian figure attributes criminal intent and/or acts on stereotypical assumptions based on an individual's race, color, ethnicity, and other identity markers. Examples of racial profiling are a police officer who assumes that a person is prone to offending behavior because he or she is Black or Indigenous, or a shop clerk who tells a group of Black youth they cannot enter the shop at the same time, but allows a group of white youth in. Number 9, prejudices. A prejudice is a false or unwarranted and often negative opinion or attitude towards a person or group because they are different. An example is perceiving a person as inferior to themselves because of their race. A prominent example is a Black woman who walks into a shop and is nicely told, "Ma'am, I think this shop is too expensive for you. I recommend that you go to another shop where the prices are more affordable." Number 10, racial bias. A bias is an inclination of temperament or perspective, often a judgment or opinion. bias can be defined as a favorable or unfavorable prejudice to one group or person over another and is often seen as unfair. Implicit biases are biases which are unintentionally activated without the individual's awareness or intentional control. Our implicit biases tend to be more favorable toward our own ethnic group and are difficult to access through introspection. Most individuals have implicit racial biases. That stinks. Number 11. White privilege and white supremacy. White supremacy is the belief that humans of white races or paler complexion are superior to humans belonging to other racial groups. As early as the 19th century, we can find several writings defending this superiority based on studies with scientific pretensions. This ideology is often associated with violent groups or organizations, such as those racists called the Ku Klux Klan, and others like them. Today, studies tend to talk about white privilege. White people have more advantages in society because of the color of their skin. These advantages are invisible to those who benefit from them. Even though these facts were reported more than 30 years ago, these benefits still exist, without the people who have them really becoming aware of them, because over time, they have become a given. Examples of white privilege are to be widely represented with political power, to be assured that the story represents my group in a majority and positive way, not to be accused of living in a ghetto when you live mainly with whites, to easily find posters, picture books, dolls, or children's magazines representing your group, not to undergo an identity check by the police for no apparent reason, not having to speak or justify yourself on behalf of all members of your group, feeling welcome and normal in most situations related to public, institutional, and social life. So now you know what racism is all about.